Okay, perfect. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for the final session of day 4. We are going to be covering something really great today in our final panel for the day. So if you give me a second just to share my screen. I have my panelists here waiting in the waiting room to join me. So we're going to be talking today about updates to ICH GCP and covering things like E6R3 and more importantly, how quality by design impacts the trial master file. We've got about an hour scheduled, so there's going to be a little bit of upfront discussion and education, and then there's going to be a lot more dialogue, Q&A, and so on. So if you guys have questions that you want to field to the audience, the team will be looking at the Q&A panel as well as a chat, so you can feel free to add those questions in. Just a few housekeeping rules. I know this is repetitive if you've been to a few sessions, but this session will be recorded like others. All attendees will receive a certificate of attendance following the TMF Week conference. This panel is interactive, so please ask questions, as I mentioned. Following all sessions, there are networking breaks, so please jump into the networking lounges. There are topics for different discussions that you can join. To introduce our speakers today, so I have Dawn Nickham, who's the Senior Director of QA and Compliance, who's also a member of our advisory board for TMF Week. So thank you, Dawn, for all of your involvement there. Dawn is going to be leading today's panel and is joined by Judy Zahora, who's the Director of GCP Quality Risk Management and Process Improvement, Barbara Novak, Associate Director of Clinical Operations Systems and Process at Kiowa Kirin, and then we have Jim Markley, who is the TMF project lead at Just-in-Time GCP. Barbara is having a few audio issues joining today, so we may or may not hear from Barbara, but if we do, it's all smiles. If we don't, all frowns. So we'll see what happens there. So with that, I am going to add all of these wonderful people to the stream. Hello, wonderful people.
Hello, wonderful.
I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and you are able now to start sharing your screen, Dawn.
Perfect. Okay, and I will in just a second. So I do want to say to all of our members, all the folks listening in, we want to make this super interactive. So I do have some questions we've come up with, some things we definitely can talk all day long about ICH E6R3 and E8R1, but we want this to be your session. So those burning questions you may have around that, please do put those in the Q&A. We'll be watching that and throwing that out to the panelists as we go on. Oh, all right. So let me share my screen. Make sure the right one comes up. That looks good. All right, fantastic. So I'm not going to bore you to death for all of those that start rolling and going, oh my gosh, this is one of those GCP QA things. I do want to level set us a little bit. So I'm sure many of you have attended some of the sessions put on by FDA, EMA that have been happening over the last several weeks. Some of these slides, full disclosure, are taken directly from their content. I didn't copy. I redid the slides, but I am using their words because I think they drive a really good message home. And I'm going to touch on a little bit of both, and I'll talk about why we need to think about both in tangent a little bit. So, you know, why did FDA, why did ICH, not just FDA, why did ICH say, okay, we just did ICH E6R a few years ago. Why are we updating it again, especially after they went almost 20 years in the first update? Well, there's things that are changing. One thing is R2 was very basic. Updates was an addendum to R1. There really wasn't a complete revamp. But what they're looking at, and you've heard about this today, you know, in some of the other presentations, is, you know, around advancing evidence generation. We've seen that in folds and folds as the COVID vaccines were developed. We are increasingly in the world. A lot of the same reasons the last year and a half has certainly pushed us even more in that direction. And then finally, we do have these innovative clinical trial designs. It's not necessarily the traditional phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, et cetera, and submission. We have companies that have even filed on phase 1 because they've taken that phase 1 and designed it such that they were able to move into that efficacy and get enough evidence that they felt they could file, especially in some of the rare disease states. So it's been an interesting year, and it's an interesting time as we start getting ahead, and as ICH E6R3 is right on the horizon. Back in 2017, they actually did write a reflection paper. I did give you the reference to this. I believe the link's in here. If not, email me and I'm happy to get you the reference, or just Google this title. But this really does talk through why they felt they needed to really renovate GCP. We're in a whole new world when it comes to GCP. And again, we want to look at that. We want to ensure that what we're saying and how we're doing clinical trials is matching up with today's technology and today's methods of doing studies. This slide, and I even gave the credit from the May 18th, 19th, so really hot off the press, was presented at that meeting, and it really spoke to me in a way that I had not thought about with the E-family integration. So one of the things that happened as all these guidelines got developed, they didn't always necessarily talk to each other and through each other and think about how it impacts other guidelines that are also impacted by that. And that is really one big change that ICH is trying to do, and why we're updating E6. So the updated ICH E8, we started talking a lot about quality by design. Quality by design in the clinical space is a little bit newer, but it certainly has been around actually for quite a long time on the GMP side, on the manufacturing side. So again, they're not introducing something brand new and a brand new quality concept. It's really something that's been around, and it's really something to really think about as you're designing your clinical study. And as such, and we're going to talk to this, how we collect data from those studies, because if our study design is completely different, the data that we collect, the things we put in our TMF, it just kind of goes right along that. So I really love this slide. It's one of my favorites. It really does talk about how the different ICH guidances, the efficacy ones, how they speak to each other and how they're intertwined. I think it's super, super important. All right, so ICH E6R3, I didn't have monumental knowledge of exactly what's going into that. All we have is what the regulators have done so far. And we do know that when R2 came out, they introduced these concepts of risk and quality management, but it was an addendum. So everything else in ICH E6 stood, but they added some pieces in there. Added some pieces about technology, and they added about quality and risk management. R3, we are told, is going to be a complete rewrite of the guidance, and it will focus to risk-based approaches. So everything, when you think about clinical trials, when you think about your company, when you think about anything in pharma and in device, we should be thinking about how are we doing that on a risk-based approach. It will add, again, quality by design, which is already in E8, and it's going to closely link to E8. So they really are going to take a big effort to say E8 is a start, the big piece about how you start out a clinical trial. Now these are all the pieces about how you run them, and run them in a way that will ensure the two most important things: data integrity, and the most important thing is human subject protection or participant protection, patient safety, whatever you want to call that. That's the most important thing. All right, so ICH E8 is about the door, likely next month is what they're proposing, if nothing else delays them in getting it out. But it really had three kind of core elements to it. And the first was this idea of qualified design of your clinical studies. So thinking about making your clinical trials fit for purpose, taking us a little bit out of that mindset in phase 1, this is all we do in phase 2, this is in phase 3, what we do. No, let's talk about our compound, let's talk about our patient population, and let's think about how do we design our trials so that we are able to get the best data out of that. It also talked about critical to quality factors. So again, risk management, we've been talking about this for a while. If you don't have risk management plans yet, actually, I just had this discussion about companies that didn't through the pandemic and how they were not doing well. You know, you need to have them in place. And your risk management plan is also going to identify things like how we document things and where we store that documentation, TMF. So, you know, you identify critical quality first, and then you identify your risk, and always should be in that order. That's my little soapbox. Then talked about a little bit about development planning. So again, you know, looking at your design that you should reflect current knowledge of the disease state and of your compound. So not every study should be a cookie cutter of the other. I've come from companies that literally copy and paste the protocol they started with in phase 1, and you see some of those same elements in phase 3. You know, really what, you know, ICH is saying now is no, you need to start fresh. It doesn't mean you don't have boilerplate stuff, but you really need to think about what is our current knowledge and how do we build our study to get the answers we need while you think about those previous studies. So what did we learn in those previous studies that was helpful and what wasn't helpful? What questions are we trying to answer with this experiment on humans? And again, there may be different types of studies across that product life cycle. So it doesn't mean that you're a cookie cutter from 1 to 3 or 1 to submission. They also introduced some things around the design elements. You know, I always say this with protocols to allow some flexibility. I mean, why do we want some flexibility? Well, certainly because we want to be able to, you know, change things within the protocol that is not changing the ultimate endpoints, isn't changing the ultimate safety, isn't changing our ultimate data integrity. But where we can allow flexibility, then we can keep moving along with that protocol and you avoid those ugly things called protocol deviations and violations. You know, they did talk about encompassing some important elements and they outline what those are. And really taking a combination of design and data sources that's where you're going to identify these critical to quality factors. So again, it all pulls together. So that was a really, really quick overview of this. And I'm going to go ahead and end the show. And we're going to have all our panelists come up. So I will end the show and stop sharing so you can see all of their beautiful faces. Okay, great. I'm not sure if we have Barbara or not, but if we do, great. The first question that I wanted to start out with, and we'll look at the chat as well, is, you know, from your perspective, and we have different perspectives here. We have people a little more TMF, and I brought in a little more clinical quality people as well. You know, when you look at ICH E6 and R3 and what's coming, how do you think that's going to impact both the population and the management of our trial master file? And Jim, I see your lovely face, so I'm going to go ahead and start with you on that.
Well, I'm hoping that what it means is that organizations are going to start feeling a lot more comfortable with taking a risk-based approach to TMF. You know, I think there's still a lot of organizations out there who are doing 100% QC of everything, you know, making sure absolutely nothing gets through, but it's very resource intensive to do that. And so with R3 coming into effect, you know, we're hoping that what we're going to see is people taking the time to develop a risk-based approach that hopefully will save a little bit time on resources, but will really help them identify what's important in their TMF and where they need to focus those resources.
Yep, that makes sense. Judy, would you like to add to that and think about?
As a matter of fact, because ICH E6R3 was really fascinating to listen to. The difference is that in R2, there was a lot of talk about quality tolerance limits. And conceptually that makes sense if you have that kind of a background and you understand that kind of, but teaching the clinical staff about quality tolerance limits, getting people to understand that some level of risk is okay, really hard, very, very difficult to execute. But what our ICHE 6R3 emphasized was the culture of quality. And that was wildly interesting because it's the first time I've ever seen those kind of guidances, documents to talk about quality culture. And, to me, that's fundamental, right? If you don't have a culture of quality, things as how your clinical studies are run, they're not, it's not consistent. It's difficult to be consistent. It's difficult to have consistent output. It's difficult then, your TMF, which is your final product. It is the end result of a clinical trial. It's the thing that you can touch. And so to have that consistently, but if the drivers are always speed and cost, it's hard to make time for the quality. But if you build a culture of quality, if you start from that starting point, then it's understood that if we build it here at the beginning and all of the things that are needed, including the plans, the communication, the agreements, all of that at the beginning, it saves us a world of hurt at the end when we're trying to clean up after the elephants.
That's so true, and we do that a lot, way more than we do. So, as you're thinking about this, it just, leads me into thinking also about, how we think ICH E6R3 will impact other functional areas responsibility with the TMF. So certainly I think clinical thinks about ICH E6 a lot. What about our other areas? How are we pulling them in to think about the documents that they're creating and designing? Particularly, as you said, and I'm going to throw this to you first, Judy, when you think about designing a clinical trial and the documentation, which is key, how do you think this will change that? Or will it?
Well, I mean, there's certainly, I hope it gives everybody I hope it does. I mean, first off, I hope it does. Teaching the quality tolerant limits, teaching control chart, and teaching all of that has been difficult because that's not people's skills, right? That's not really what they were hired to do in their skill. It's not natural. But cultural quality, I think, can be natural. And it's really about communication, effective communication up front. It's all about that. So as long as the expectations are set, both sides understand, the CRO, or if you have one, or anybody involved in the trial, that's understood, and then document it, because, of course, as we know, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. So as long as that's done up front, then the end result is clear. We don't have to do 100% review, because what we know is that the essential documents are where they need to be. So it comes down to, as much as, in this outside of your question, is when we start a trial, what do we want the TMF to look like? What do we intend it to be? Is there consistent indexing? Is every study run the same way? And I know that there are studies that every study has its own, every study's special, right? They're all special.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, but the end result is you got to have essential documents, and they're not really different from any particular trial. So having an index, having a clear understanding of what goes in, and having a clear understanding of when they're going to be reviewed, what's going to be reviewed, what's the expectation, all of that is communication. It's just communication, and do that up front makes perfect sense.
And I'm going to throw another question at you, Judy, because I think there was a nice comment in chat that says, I think it's difficult to determine how and where to document decisions about risk, which I think, and Jim, I'll come to you on that. But I think it goes to exactly what you're saying, all these things we're doing, how difficult should it be to document it? And, where do you think your teams struggle on that?
Oh, I think the teams struggle in that. Here, let me tell you. Were you finished? Let me tell you how I feel. I think the teams struggle in that there are many, many tools for risk assessment. And but they're very complicated. They're really complicated, and not the it's not the fact that it's an FMA. That part's not the complicated part. The part is that they're big, and it takes the time to sit down, and every function has to participate. It's not the clinical trial manager, can't make the decisions for everybody. Any function that has a role within that trial has to participate. What are the risks you see? What could possibly happen? And if it happens, how are we going to mitigate it? That's all it is. It's not a difficult tool in that way. But when someone sits down with a risk assessment tool from, any of the people that have them, and they're beautiful and great, and they see 200 lines, it frankly frightens them. And it's easier to break it up into bits, but it also takes time. So when you are on a clinical trial and your goal is to get people in that trial and on the trial and then start up, to sit down at 200 lines, get all the people involved that need to be involved is frankly frightening.
Yeah. And I think it's quite difficult. And I think, Judy, a couple things I know you pointed out, and then Jim, I'm going to let you talk, but it just triggers my head. It's that time effort, even more so than the documentation effort itself, because there are tools out there to do it. And again, it doesn't have to be, this isn't rocket science. I've seen small companies use things like Excel to document it. As long as that's controlled, you can flip that in your TMF and version it up if you want, especially if you have an eTMF that, you have some document control on. If you don't have that, you just date things. I mean, there's ways to do this that doesn't take a real fancy tool if you don't have the money for it. But it's that point of doing it and taking the time to do that, and that's where they struggle. So same question to you, Jim, is around, some of the ICH impact around functional areas of responsibility in the TMF. Do you see that changing?
I think my answer mirrors Judy's pretty closely. I hope so. When you talk about something being quality by design, that really means that everyone's on board. It's that culture of quality. And Judy really highlighted communication. I think the other half of that is effective training. If you can't really effectively train anyone if you haven't already developed a process that's robust. Because if you're training people on what you have and what you have doesn't really define things, then they're kind of in the same situation as everyone else, just trying to do their best. But like Judy said, if TMF is not their area of expertise, their starting point is already at a different kind of location. They're not able to work in that gray area quite like someone who's in a records management department who has seen how many TMFs over the years. So I'm hoping this is going to make a change, but in reality, it's all going to start from going back to the beginning, evaluating your process, updating your process if needed, making sure that all of your functional areas, regardless of whether you have a 2-person biostats group and you just outsource it every time, but you have the 2 people in there, they need to know what's going on as well, and they need to be completely on board with it, and they need to be able to hold their biostats vendor to the same standards that you are trying to hold them to. It's the communication and it's the training across kind of all the functional areas.
Yeah, makes sense. So we actually have a question that does anyone consider TMF as a QTL? So I guess maybe completeness or your metrics in your TMF, or is it just a critical process?
No, I think that you have to have some sort of a metric or measure. You need to understand, and it needs to be assessed periodically. But what's going to be assessed, how that's defined, how often, has to be decided up front. And you continue with, and that's the risk-based part, right? You might decide that you look at it every 6 months, but if you look at it in 6 months and it's a kind of a mess, then you come back and you go, okay, well, our risk mitigation is that didn't work. Let's try something else.
Yeah.
Completely agree.
And it may be that you need to look at it more often than every 6 months too.
Well, right.
We had a discussion around periodic review earlier today, and actually someone else that presented today, and we did talk about how often should you do this? And we had a number of people in the poll respond that they did it at the end of the study or when an inspection happened.
Wow.
Yeah, we all get those faces on us because by that time, what I'm going to say, and I know it, I've seen it, it's
too late.
It's
it
too
is
late.
Then you're sweeping up
at
after
this
the
point,
elephants with a dustpan like this.
Yeah, well, that point, you just have to hope they don't step in the biggest pile at that point, to be honest.
That's
And so, yeah. Jim, what are some metrics that you've seen used, maybe particularly, and I think they're asking if TMF, some of the TMF metrics, could be considered, something along the line of quality tolerance limits or one of your key quality indicators. I think it can, and I think it is one of the important things, but what have you seen used that is actually helpful?
Well, you can use just about anything, but what's important is that you identify what is acceptable and what's not acceptable. And I really urge people that when you're doing this, it's not just like the ideal world. You got to almost start somewhere that's reasonable, something that's achievable. If you want to say that a timely TMF is, uploaded to approved in 5 days, that's great, certainly timely. Is it realistic? Probably not. But you also don't want to say that a year is timely, because then that's not really timely, but it's certainly achievable. So finding that kind of sweet spot where, maybe you start with 45 days, and if your organization shows that they can do 45 days with no problem, then you bump it up. It doesn't have to be set in stone right off the bat, but you need to identify something that you can measure with some sort of recourse. If it's, what are you going to do if you don't hit it? There's no point setting a limit if every single study you own is not going to meet that. You're just putting yourself in hot water, right? It's constant improvement, but in order to kind of going back to that culture of quality, right? You have to start somewhere, and if that somewhere is something that's maybe not exactly where you want, but you get the whole team on board because they're achieving it, great. I think we have so much technology that goes along with this. All of these eTMF vendors out there, there's so much technology at your fingertips that you can leverage to get metrics. Once again, the biggest thing I can urge is that look at what those metrics you can get are, and are they explained in your process? Because if you're not having people do it in your process, then the metric doesn't really mean anything. So those kinds of things, I mean, it really can be anything. It's just what your organization defines as a quality TMF. And I think if you have those points and you're hitting those points, I think you're going to have a hard time finding an inspector that says, well, you didn't measure this one thing that I really wanted to know.
Jim, you made really a couple good points. First off is don't measure something that you're not going to take action on, right? If it's not actionable, don't measure it. Collecting measurements, collecting data is expensive and time consuming, and it ticks people off, frankly, if you're going to measure them and there is no escalation or plan what to do with that data. So if you can't do anything with it, don't collect it today. Maybe further maturity, you can get there, don't collect it today. The other point is too, is about when you put a cycle time, when you determine a cycle time, again, make certain that it makes sense, that it's reasonable. And if you don't know, then call it a pilot. Pilot it for 6 months, pilot it for 3 months, 6 months, see what that data is, because if you don't have any point of reference, you don't. Please don't put any cycle time in an SOP that you absolutely are not going to monitor, measure, and have an escalation for. Please don't do that. There's very little regulatory requirements for a cycle time in an SOP. The only one I can think of is for AE reporting. Otherwise, don't put it in there, because if you say you're going to do it, darn tootin' you have to.
Yeah. So, when we've looked at health authority inspections, what red flags for quality or data integrity have you seen now when they're reviewing TMF? You know, what have you already seen in inspections, even as we get ready to raise out R3? And Jim, I'll go ahead and start with you this time.
Yeah, I mean, I hate to give a similar answer to the last one, but you have to be able to explain what you're doing. I think the biggest red flag I've seen is if an inspector is either remote access to your TMF or if they're having a guided view and they ask a question and you can't answer it. If you don't know how your own process works, if you don't know how your own TMF works, that's the red flag. That's the knowledge that the inspector has of, okay, well, if you don't know how this works, you probably weren't in there a lot monitoring it, especially if you've outsourced your TMF, right? Your CRO is the one that's been handling the TMF. That's great. That's fine. You need to have oversight of it. And if they ask you for a guided view and you're clicking around because you don't know how to find things or you don't know how to change the view, that's a red flag. Other than that, right, you should have defined TMF processes. So if an inspector is looking at something on your screen or their screen and they say, I don't really understand why this is filed here, or you use this document date, if you have it documented in, let's say it's an index or a TMF map or structure, whatever you want to call it, and you can speak to why you've done it, the inspector doesn't have a lot of room to say, they could say, maybe that's not my preference, but if it's standardized and you can explain it, you're in a lot better shape than you think you are. So to me, that's the really big red flag. If you can't explain what you're doing, then they just know that they're going to have a field day.
All right, Don, we have a couple of questions on the side here.
Sure.
I'm not sure if we hit them all. So does the panel have recommendations or links to answer the question, how best to document and where to document decisions about risk? So we did talk about risk and why it was important, but we didn't talk about how the documentation. There's lots of different ways. You can do it in a risk assessment spreadsheet, you know, whatever tool you're using for risk assessment. You can do it in meeting minutes. That's not my favorite way because it's hard to pull decisions out. But meeting minutes also documents it. An issues and action log, that can be documented there as well. I see that. Jim, do you see it documented elsewhere?
Pretty much those exact same methods you just mentioned. Yep.
All right. Please don't document that.
And some people have systems also that they document it within their system.
Sure.
That's fine. But yeah, I mean, again, you know, when it comes to this piece, pick a way that makes sense to your company, that is simple, and people will do it. I mean, that's, you know, that people will go to whatever document, whatever system, whether you put in meeting minutes, you know, put it on as an action item on every clinical trial meeting that you talk about risk, and then, you know, is there any changes when you are doing your periodic reviews of that? You know, make sure that you have that set up so people come to the table and look and ready to discuss this, and they're ready to say something. And that's really the most important piece. You know, again, so, you know, make it simple. Keep it, I'm all about the KISS principle for everything. To what Judy has said around SOPs, don't put a process in place you're not going to follow, because that is the biggest red flag. And also, I think, Jim, you touched on it, make sure you know your processes. I see too often sponsors that give their CROs the TMF to manage, and they don't, you know, they don't even go and look at the TMF. I give sponsors access to TMF all the time, and they never even get in their TMF. I can tell they've never logged into it. And you know, we talk to them about it, say, well, when there's an inspector, what are you going to do? So, you know, because I'm not going to be there to navigate for the inspector. I mean, I could be if you really want me to be, but what is an inspector going to think when they say, hello, study manager, can you show me where your risk management plan is? Can you show me where you documented your risk assessments? And they get the deer in the headlights look. Not going to work. You know, oh, my CRO took care of that. Yeah, I don't care. You need to show me. You had to have oversight. So, you know, keep those in mind. I think I had one
just
other
to
question.
add to that real
ahead,
fast. You know, to take that even one step further, it's not unheard of for an inspector to ask a question while, you know, they're doing a review. The TMF person might not be in the room. The CRO person might not be in the room, and they say, "Hey, I'm looking at this and I'm not understanding what's going on. And it might be a very simple question. And if your answer as the clinical study lead or the QA representative is, oh, I'll get someone in here who knows what you're talking about, and it's, you know, it's something that you would need to know if you were involved in the study, they might call you out on that. It's not unheard of to say, no, I don't want the TMF person. You as the lead were supposed to be having, you know, oversight of your functional area. Where's this at? And if they've never been in the TMF, it's going to be really obvious.
Yeah, and no matter how well you organize it, because again, you know, to us who understand the reference model backwards and forwards, we know exactly where things go. But we've also, you know, put a lot of documents there, or looked at a lot of documents there. If you don't do that on a daily basis, you're not going to know. So you need to understand that. I also see a comment here that some folks are documenting their decision in the risk management plan record as well. So again, they could have an ADI log or whatever right within that risk management plan artifact, I think is what they mean. Also in their vendor oversight records when virtually and outsourced. So again, you know, those are things that we want to see. We want them to do. Let me see if I have any other questions, or I'm going to come up with another one. Okay. So how do you define TMF quality noncompliance, and when do you estimate that? So when we think about, you know, these TMFs getting popular, I'm going to throw a little maybe anecdote in here. You know, see these TMFs getting populated at the last hour. For those, I'm going to date myself because the slide is from several years ago when Andy Fisher put up that slide and you saw the graph, and you know, this is when the inspection was, and this is how the document number. It's my favorite
I'm sure
slide
that was
ever.
an anomaly. I'm sure that was an anomaly.
Yeah, I don't think so. He threw it up and everybody hung their heads, and you know, because they all hung their heads, and it was like, it wasn't me. But yeah, I mean, we know those things happen. We know there's always a rush at inspection time, but there shouldn't be. You know, how do we build quality into that TMF from day one?
I'll go first. I mean, it goes right back to that quality culture, right? It's creating your TMF processes quality by design. You have to have a definition of what quality is, what a compliant TMF is. Otherwise, how do you even identify non-compliance? I think it's really important to think about trends when you're doing this. No one is perfect. No organization is perfect. People are going to misfile documents. Are you misfiling one document, or is every follow-up letter in the wrong place? You know, it's important to understand the scope of the error that we're talking about. If you have a clear process and you've trained people on it, and people are making mistakes, either the training didn't cover that, or you need to retrain people on what that is. It may even just be one user, but when you're doing those periodic reviews, when you're doing that kind of oversight of your TMF, identifying trends, and then from trends, now you're saying, okay, this is non-compliance. They're not doing this right. The escalation pathway is hopefully written somewhere. If it's not, that's another question. But you know, going to you know, governance level or something like that to say, hey, this is our end product. We need this to be in good shape now before, you know, we have a whole set of COVs that are now filed in the wrong place. So it's all about trying to get ahead of the curve, identifying trends as early as possible, and providing a solution to that trend. Not every trend can be fixed, of course. Sometimes you just have to say, all right, we're adding it to the map. This is the new location. I'm not moving 1,000 of these. But you have to try and do your best to get those trends.
Well, Jim, you know, a couple things that just struck in my head. One, if everybody's filing it in a different place, did we select the right place to file it in the first place?
Yeah, absolutely.
A place that doesn't make sense to the rest of the world, and that's a possibility. So that's one thing, you know, that I'm thinking of, you know. And again, we're not going to move the 1,000 documents because it's not, well, it should be fairly easy in an eTMF, but it still takes time.
Sometimes.
Yeah. But, so that's one piece. But, the other piece with this a piece that I thought, and Judy, I want you to address this too, is, identifying trends and following trends and ensuring that, we hit, and I'm going to use the words root cause of what the issue is. When I see a kappa and I see retraining on it, I tear that kappa apart to say, show me where they weren't properly trained. Well, this procedure was this. I'm like, that has nothing to do with training. That's your procedure, or that's your process.
You're spot on. Boy, I'll tell you what, root cause, human error, the fixed retraining, that just makes my head pop off. And in fact, here's another one that makes my head pop off. There's a question here, what are your thoughts on notes to file? Well, let me tell you about my thoughts on notes to file. I'm morally opposed. There are very few reasons that a note to file is required. Here's one. A document wasn't signed and the PI is dead. Then you get a note to file. Other than that, I can't actually think of any other legitimate reason to have a note to file. You might as well just stick a red flag up there and go, hey, we're not doing something, and we know we're not doing something right, but we're not going to fix it.
Yep.
So,
well, Judy knows we did a panel on notes to file at SQA, so we do have this talk. I really, because I have a little more clinical in me, I do, for my clinical side, I was like, we wrote a lot of notes to file. But where my head pops off with the notes to file is the things that are stupid, like you just said. The things that are in a note to file that just blatantly, says this is a problem, this is an issue, we did this completely wrong, and stops. And that's really where the problem is. You can't stop with just saying, hey, inspector, we really messed up. Please write your inspection finding on this right here that I did. Please write it right here. It's all written out for you. You can copy and paste right there from it. But if you put in there when it's going to be blatantly obvious to the inspector, and not necessarily in a note to file, there's other places you can document this as well. When you really put in there, we did identify this, but this is what we did to improve. This is what we did to change the ultimate outcome of our trial, and this is what we did to ensure, what are my two favorite things, that the data is okay and that the patients are safe. Because if you've taken care of those two things and you can prove it, it does make a big difference.
Jim,
and
I'm sorry.
I was gonna add this question: how hard is it to remember your inspector is human too? He's not a bot, not perfect, reflecting the regulations. And that, yeah, I'm sure in your time, Judy and Jim, you've seen that, where inspectors come up with stuff. It's like, where did they get that from?
Yeah, absolutely. And the other side of that, right, them being human, if your process is frustrating, they're going to get frustrated. Mm-hmm. And if they're frustrated, they're more likely to be willing to say, you know what, I'm just going to, this is a finding. I can't deal with this. Just keep that in mind. If your TMF is really difficult to use, they're not going to want to use it. And that's not necessarily a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And, and that goes to the technology and having, what I always call the three pillars of what we need to have right. And, you do want to have technology that makes sense, because when you don't, people struggle. But if you don't have a robust process, and not a process that outlines everything that you're going to get in trouble and not follow, but a process that really says this is how we do things, and the right people and the people with the right information and the right tools to do that really bang up job, that's exactly, so it's always in that order. It's technology, process, and people, and if you take care of it in that order, I think you're in good hands. Okay, so I think I'm up to date on questions.
Well, here's one more.
Please.
Do we need a note to file for any document that was marked as applicable in the TMF index at the study start, but not received by the end of the study? Do you want to take that, Jim?
No,
you don't.
update your index. I'm
Exactly.
sorry.
Exactly. No, you're absolutely right. If you're doing periodic reviews, first of all, what a great time to take a look at your index. You've just done this potentially exhaustive review of your TMF. You know what's in there, you know what's not in there. There's no better time to make an update. At the end of your study, and every document is in, most systems have some pretty easy technology that you can use to figure out what has no content in it. You can update your index, you're versioning them. If you have versioning control, it's very clear to see when you provide that index to the inspector, if that's what they're asking for. There's your clear roadmap. There's no need for you to explain why it became not applicable. If they really want to know, you can probably ask because, or you can probably answer it because it's either probably a process thing or it's a study design thing. Did you think that you were going to do interim analysis and then the data showed you didn't need to do it? Well, those are all not applicable now, and that's totally fine. Just mark it that way so that it's clear that you're not expecting content there, and the inspector shouldn't look for content there.
Yeah, I think some of it goes to in some people's GCP minds that you can leave something blank, you can never leave something empty. You always have to do something to mark it out, cross it out, put not applicable, do something with it. And when you're thinking of your TMF, whether it's a fancy TMF with a really robust system and expected document list and all that good stuff, or if it's something as simple as paper, people still do paper TMFs, believe it or not. You still, your index can drive that, but you do have times when you have documents, and I'm going to ask this question of you, Judy, documents that should have been in the TMF that really are an essential document, but they're gone. They're not located. So at that point, what do you do and how do you document that? Or do you, how do you handle that? How do you advise teams to handle that, Judy?
Well,
sorry, that was a hard question.
Yeah, that's a bunch of questions. So, that's.
I put you on the spot, Jim.
I'm going to take
you off the hook.
I'm going to think of what would be the best advice for that.
Yeah.
Jim, go ahead. You got something?
You want to say note to file, but you just can't bring yourself to do it.
Yeah. So you're saying content that's you're expecting to be in the TMF, but then it's missing at the end of the study. Yeah. What to do with that? I think, talk about our 3 risk-based approach. I mean, right. Is this a critical document that you need to have, or is this you're missing that one last email approval of so-and-so? If it's something minor, maybe it's not as big of a deal. But if you're missing, we don't know where our CSR went. Okay, well, you need to do something about that, right? You need to do some sort of risk assessment to figure out how are you going to handle that. I know something that we've done before is if you're doing like periodic reviews or you do an end of study review, right, you're identifying things that are missing. And if that's the case, you probably have some form of escalating those missing documents, whether that's an Excel query log, whether that's internal to the system, whatever that may be. If you have made attempts to receive the document and it cannot be collected, it should be documented there. Please do not give your query log to an inspector. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that your process is there to say that we've done our due diligence to try and collect these documents. Maybe you're filing a certificate of review at the end and you say, we've reviewed the TMF. Any identified missing documents have been followed up. If they were not collected, whatever kind of guidance you would have put there is fine. But obviously, please do not give anyone your query log, but there should be some way for you to rely upon your process to say, these are all the ways we tried to catch this and resolve this, and it just didn't happen.
I actually
storyboard, I think.
Yeah, I actually keep my queries within my system. So the inspectors see it. We have quality issues in our system.
Okay. Yep.
And I actually, I would say, and it's kind of goes back to early EDC days as well, where people were so afraid to put something in a query. Oh my gosh, they would be able to see this. But it also shows what you've done and your due diligence to correct things that are not right. And, should have, some link to a process somewhere that talks about escalation process, because there are mistakes that happen, there are issues that happen. How are we going to deal with that? And again, it goes back to my same thing with the notes file and everything else. I'm really careful in how I document things, in that just say, well, we tried and we tried and we tried and we couldn't get it. Did we have a breakdown in the process? Maybe we can't fix that one document, but did we have a breakdown in the process way upstream that missed that document? If I've already closed a study site and I missed getting something from that study site, then that was the problem, that maybe my monitoring process is not robust. Maybe my document collection process is not robust. Maybe my instructions to the site were not clear, that we expect that these documents come in. There's lots of, we can look in that. It's not someone just forgot to get this generally. It's really there's something that broke down, because by study end that should have been there. It's not there, something broke down upstream. It would be my thought.
I guess, yeah, I'm sorry. But I think too, at that point, it becomes a storyboard, right? Something that says, this is what we've done. We understand that we have a problem. This is what we've done all the places we've looked under the desk, behind the wall, we've done all the things we've done, the timeline of how we've done it, and this is a gap we understand in our process, and this is where we're going forward. But I think the storyboards, and of course you never get that to an inspector, but when someone goes in to talk to an inspector, they have the whole thought in their head, this is what we've done, and this is what we tried to do to correct it. This is where we're going. So, sometimes stuff happens. It just does.
I completely agree with you, and I think the important thing to point out there is the difference between a storyboard and a note to file.
Yes,
right?
Yes, good point.
Not everything needs to be a note to file, but that doesn't mean that you can't summarize it in a storyboard if you're going towards trends or something like that. If you are not confident that you're going to be able to speak to it, or it's a little complex and you want to make sure you have all your ducks in a row, a storyboard is a great way to make sure that you are able to speak to it. The inspector does not require that everything that happened is directly written on a piece of paper saying, this is why we didn't do X or why we came to this decision. Yes, parts of that are going to be documented here and there, but if you're going to talk about how we dealt with the versioning of the monitoring plan when we switched CROs and all of that kind of stuff, a storyboard is just way easier to be able to talk someone through. And if this is your phase 1 study and you're not going to be inspected until 4 years from now, no one is going to remember that. Reading through that note to file might not even help. You need that robust storyboard to really help you be able to explain it in a concise manner that they won't even ask for anything further.
Well, and I think just to add, and I love storyboards, by the way, I think they're really important, but don't make them so convoluted that they're not helpful either. Make sure you make them concise. But it is, it's one of those things that you say, you make a risk-based decision, throw it out, that we know we might take a hit on this, but we cannot do anything to change that. All we can say is, okay, it's self-identified. We know this happened. This is, and in that storyboard, start putting, attach your kappas to it. Like, what are we going to do to make sure it doesn't happen anymore? So we are getting close to the end of the session, and I wanted to give each of the panelists just a minute to give any last thoughts around ICH E6, how it impacts our TMF, and any words of wisdom you'd like to give the group before we close out.
Judy, you want to go first?
Yeah, I'll go first. I have not a lot of words of wisdom, but I'm very excited about ICH E6 R3 because having a culture of quality, that's foundational, right? That's the foundation that scalability, organizational change, organizational excellence lives on. So I'm really excited that we're talking about culture.
Fantastic. Jim.
Don't panic. It's pretty much my guidance here. You may not be as far off from being up to date as you think you are. If you have a process that you think is already in a good place, it might just be a little bit of tweaking here and there, making sure those critical to quality measures are clearly identified, that you clearly have your escalation pathway and how you're going to deal with it and how you're going to measure it. You may already have all of the other TMF processes. It's now just kind of going that next step further to make sure it's clearly defined as to how that quality is actually measured.
Fantastic. Well, I would like to thank our panel. Thank you for your wonderful insights and all of your pieces you gave us. I'm going to go ahead and hand back over to Oliver and let him close us out.
Thank you so much, Dawn, Jim, and also Judy. It looks like Judy ended up having to jet off. And obviously thank you for Barbara for trying to get in, but was unable to do so. So we'll have to have Barbara back. We'll have to do this again, Dawn. So one of the things that I just wanted to mention before I move on is there's lots and lots of questions or lots of suggestions internally about you guys getting together and putting together a what to note to file and what not to note to file. So we've got to make that happen. So there's going to be something coming out of that. Hopefully, if I can get these guys together, everyone, I can try and get that for you guys. What I do want to, obviously, outside of thanking our great panelists, I feel like every panel I host during TMF week, I say this is the best panel so far. So I won't say that again, but I really did enjoy this panel. I thought it was an amazing sort of intersection and something that we haven't had at TMF week. I think a really different perspective and some real sort of on the ground practical advice that I think people can take away and implement with their own organizations. We have finished day 4, sad face. And tomorrow is day 5, which means it's the last day of TMF week, also sad face. But we've got 4 amazing sessions next week, tomorrow, 9 a.m. Eastern. So the first session of the day, we have a sort of case study presentation on how to implement an eTMF at a scaling CRO. If you're also in a pharma or biotech, a lot of this information is going to be relevant for you as well. So if you're thinking about implementing a system and you want to understand what are some of the steps for success, jump into that. At 10, we have Tell About a TMF Story, using integrated systems for a more holistic approach. So we're going to talk about how to connect data across different systems that may be holding TMF content. Then we're going to move on to 11 a.m., which is a little bit more of a technical subject, but something that if you guys want to have something cool to talk about at the water cooler, eTMF integration or data lake, how technology has evolved to meet the clinical trials of today. And then we will be finalizing TMF week and finishing off with an amazing panel focused on what does the next generation eTMF system look like. And we've got representatives from Pfizer, from Covance, from Syneos, from ISI, the whole gambit of sort of organizations. So with that, I will allow you guys to jump off. There are lounge tables, I will remind everybody. Dawn, Jim, if you want to continue the conversation, head over to the lounge. Maybe the team that is attending today will be able to jump in and have that conversation with you. So there's a number of different lounges open. You guys can go and have a chat. I'm going to head over there too. And so I'll speak to you guys soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.